Welcome to the AI Ireland podcast, your window into the world of AI innovation on the island of Ireland. Join us as we explore how AI is harnessed to tackle both business and societal challenges, revealing the cutting-edge solutions emerging from this vibrant AI community. Don't forget to subscribe for the latest updates and insights in the world of AI. Welcome to a special episode of the AI Ireland podcast. Today we're excited to introduce our new initiative, which is the EU AI Act podcast. This episode offers a preview of what's to come. On July 12th, the final text of the EU AI Act was published, and this significant legislation will come into effect on August 1st. In this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Gabriele Mazzini, the architect and lead author of the AI Act at the European Commission. He's also an MIT Fellow. Stay tuned for more in-depth discussions and expert insights on this groundbreaking regulation. It will be available on any podcast of your choice, so please check it out and subscribe. Hello everyone, it's Mark Kelly here. I hope you're doing really well. I'm speaking with Gabriele Mazzini, Team Leader, AI Act, Director General, European Commission, also known as the Architect and Lead Author of the EU AI Act / MIT Fellow. And we're really happy to have Gabriele because today is the 11th of July and tomorrow the final text of the AI Act is expected to be published in the EU official journal, which happens tomorrow, the 12th of July. So the aim for this is you're probably listening to this a couple of days after that. So this podcast, I think, is very timely. And we're delighted to have Gabriele on the show. Gabriele, thank you very much for joining us on our podcast today.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So before we kind of jump into your role and some of the work that you did on the EU AI Act, I think it's really important to maybe talk a little bit about your background first, particularly because you've kind of worked in a few different types of kind of startup environment, research. You've had, a kind of variety of different experiences that I think help shape you. And it's pretty important because you were architect and lead author of the EU AI Act. So I'd like to kind of get to know you as a person. It'd be great if you could tell me a little bit more about that.
I've landed in this job after a varied path. So after my law school, so I have a law degree by background. I did a PhD in criminal law, and then I started working for the institutions. So first I worked for the Court of Justice, and then I worked at the European Parliament. And after a couple of years in the EU public service, I decided to go to the US, where I did a law degree at Harvard, and then I started working there for an international organization, so an NGO actually, dealing with international cooperation. But it was an interesting project led by Professor Jeff Sachs from Columbia University. And mostly, what I learned there, a couple of issues. So first of all, the impact of technology on how to deliver services to low-income countries. And second, I think it was really a startup-like environment, small organization, very agile, very fast. And so that triggered my interest in technology. So then after finishing my job there, I spent a couple of other years in New York working for startups. And then I moved back to Brussels. And I had a keen interest in working at the intersection of law and technology. So I found the opportunity to work on AI and emerging technologies. I started back in 2017. It was not yet, AI was not yet a buzzword. We were talking a lot about big data, IoT, emerging technologies. But so that's really when the discussion around AI started. So it was really very timely for me to be back at the Commission at that time.
When you look at, and I got into the world of AI kind of 2017, 2018, and the growth, I couldn't imagine it being so quick and so fast, and some of the impact it's having already is pretty phenomenal. Tell me a little bit about trying to create this act, why it was warranted, the reality of where do you start. And I can only imagine the word overwhelm doesn't do it any justice.
Yeah, I think it was quite an overwhelming exercise. I think very rewarding. When I look back at the origin of the AI Act, it's been a long journey. It all started with me closing myself at home for 3 weeks and sort of starting to conceptualize the AI Act. It was in the summer 2020, actually. But I have to acknowledge also that exercise, so when I came up with the whole structure, indeed the whole architecture ultimately of the AI Act, and then of course started the process of internal consultation, the Commission was relying on some work that pre-existed. So I have to mention here, the work of the high-level expert group on AI that advised the Commission between 2018 and 2020. Also, the work the Commission did on the white paper, launching a really wide consultation around all policy options for AI it was the beginning of 2020. So indeed, when I was asked to really work on the legal framework, I still felt a huge responsibility and huge complexity, but I could rely on some of the work that had already been done before. So certainly that was extremely helpful.
Just for people that are new to all this, could you just give a brief overview? The EU AI Act, what's its goals, its intentions?
The EU AI Act I would say, is the first comprehensive legal framework on AI. When I say comprehensive, I mean it's a legal framework that is not just specifically regulating the use of AI in a certain area, in a certain sector, but really cuts across most sectors. So in that sense, we say it's a horizontal type of legislation. And that, I think, it's a novelty. So the fact that indeed, and to my knowledge, is kind of the first effort globally to really regulate AI that comprehensively. So that broadly, not just in a specific area, but really much more broadly. And so the main goal of that effort of the EU AI Act is to essentially make sure that AI systems that are placed in the EU market are trustworthy. So we talk about trustworthiness of AI system, meaning they can be trusted for working properly, for not being discriminatory, for being safe, for not affecting people's health. So that's fundamentally the idea, and we do that through a number of rules and provisions. It's overall quite a complex piece of legislation, but generally, let's say the goal is to ensure that AI systems on the EU market are compliant, respect fundamental rights, are safe.
When we look at some of the key terms of the Act, could you talk us through some of those key terms and what they are? For example, defining high-risk systems or transparency requirements or accountability measures, the importance of kind of promoting trustworthy AI.
Yeah, as you say correctly, high risk, for instance, is a key concept. Is we talk about the risk-based approach. What does it mean? It means that the rules of the AI Act are tailored to the risk that the system poses, and the AI Act classifies AI systems in three major categories. So the systems that are prohibited because they kind of generate the risk that is considered not acceptable, and therefore we don't want any system of that sort in the EU. An example would be system for social scoring. The Commission proposal had foreseen 4 use cases, and the final legal text will have 8 use cases. So it's quite an extension there. Then the second criteria is about high risk. High risk means that the system poses indeed a risk that is considered, of course, important, but not to the point that it should be prohibited. So high risk AI systems are allowed, but subject to certain compliance obligations. Here we're dealing with systems that are safety components of products. Think, for instance, about medical devices or robots, due to the increasing digitalization of products, but also self-standing systems like recommender systems for banks around giving loans, or recommender systems that may be used to determine whether kids which school kids should go to. So essentially tools to assist humans in making decisions. So these systems are explicitly listed. They're also classified as high risk. And then finally, we have a third category of risk, where systems, the type of risk that the system poses, primarily linked to the lack of transparency. think about chat box. Now there's a lot of talk around generative AI. So we have this chat box that really can simulate human voices and tones. So it's really difficult sometimes to distinguish if you're speaking to a bot or to a human. So in that situations, for instance, the AI Act foresees transparency obligations. So humans should know that they're interacting with the chatbot, so with the machine, and not with another person. Other examples around synthetic content. So we want to make sure that people know that the content they're exposed to is a content that is synthetic, so they're aware of that and they're not deceived.
If anybody is probably listening in and thinking, well, you'd probably know if you're speaking to an AI, I can 100% assure you that some of the AI models that are in place for customer service, for example, or the avatars that are in place, they are 100, they're just indistinguishable between human or not. We're already seeing this in images and the videos, text to video creation, even in the last 6 months, like it's there. So having some type of watermark to say you're now engaging with an AI agent, or if you're trying to if you're looking at a text or looking at an image of a fancy kind of event that you're going to go to, it's a generated image rather than actually the reality. And I think we've seen a few examples of this come to pass in terms of the media where things went wrong. From a from a data protection perspective, and kind of we've got transparency, fairness, accountability, all these obligations that are safeguarding personal data and building trust. How does the Act look to try to safeguard personal data, and also some of the requirements around this, around privacy, accountability, and transparency?
Yeah, I mean, here the AI Act actually is not a privacy legislation, strictly speaking. So the AI Act, I mean, for those of your readers or listeners who are more lawyers and more interested in the technical details, is based on 114. So the legal basis of the Act is Article 114 of the treaty, which is the internal market legislation. Is not like, for instance, Article 16 of the treaty, which is about privacy. That being said, there are certain provisions of the AI Act that are based on the privacy legal basis. Notably, when it comes, I mean, in the Commission proposal, it was about the remote biometric identification systems in public accessible spaces. So here, because the AI Act foresees a prohibition for the use of those systems, meaning to the extent, of course, they process personal data. But if we put for a second a bit the technicalities to the side, so essentially the AI Act was born with the idea to not interfere with privacy legislation and to actually enter into the space or regulate an area which is, the placing of certain system on the market. So before actually, let's say, these systems are in use, so to say. Simply for one very simple reason, is because indeed we already have privacy legislation in place, the GDPR, as well as the Law Enforcement Directive, which is the sister legislation specifically for the processing of personal data in the field of law enforcement. And this legislation remains fully applicable, whether it's about, let's say, how developers of AI collect personal data for the training of AI systems. And then, of course, they have to comply with all the principles around GDPR, including, of course, the proper legal basis and transparency and accountability. Or also when it comes to actually the use of AI systems by what is now called a deployer, or indeed a user of AI system. If let's say I am a public administration, or I'm a company using an AI in HR, let's say I don't develop the system myself, but I kind of get it from someone else, but I use the system, right? So meaning I collect personal data that I then put into the system for the system providing me recommendations. So in that case, as a user of the AI system, I'm also subject to GDPR obligations. So because I collect personal data, which are then used to make recommendations. So in that sense, the AI Act does not want to interfere with this legislation that is already applicable. Although ultimately, as a side note, I think the final version of the AI Act foresees certain obligations that indeed tend a bit to overlap with GDPR.
How important is the role of human oversight in this EU AI governance for transparency and accountability and ultimately that kind of responsible AI advancement?
I think human oversight is key. Ultimately, I believe AI will be beneficial to humanity to the extent indeed it helps improve human abilities, but it does not necessarily substitute them. So, of course, there are situations where, and we know this very well, AI performs even better than humans. And so, even situations where humans will not be able to actually oversee the functioning of the system or any sort of kind of in the loop type of oversight would probably be less functional or even disruptive than to let the system, let's say, handle certain processes by itself. But in the broader scheme of things, I really believe that AI should serve us in improving our decision making, in improving our processes, but making sure that human intelligence remain involved. And so the AI Act foresees one specific requirements around human oversight, but that doesn't mean it's one size fits all. So indeed, depending on the application, that human oversight may take different forms, and I expect that to be fleshed out more in detail in the course of the standardization process, depending indeed on the type of application.
We look a little bit on the compliance and navigating the EU AI Act for business, right? Particularly on the kind of impact. How do you look at those potential risks for businesses under the Act? Emphasizing compliance, risk assessment, transparency, innovation, ethics, and international cooperation. And then we know that non-compliance is going to lead to penalties, reputational damage. Is it also potentially not being able to sell your products or services in the European Union? Again, I'm not sure if that was something I just overheard or if that's actually a reality of you not being compliant.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, of course, a company should do is to know what kind of systems they use. That's the first question, really. So you have to make sure that you're aware about the AI systems that are part of your production processes or service delivery, because you need to know what those systems are and what they're doing, right? So that's the first step. And the second step is, of course, understanding how those systems are impacted by the risk classification of the AI Act. So certain systems may even be prohibited. So, for instance, the final version of the AI Act foresees a prohibition for emotion recognition systems in the workplace and education institution unless there is a medical or safety reason. So, in principle, we see there indeed that there is certain systems that may be used today are actually outright prohibited. And that, of course, if you use a system that is prohibited, you're subject to sanctions. But certainly, the most relevant compliance burden is about high risk. So, because if you indeed use a system that is high risk, let's say use a system in HR to select resumes or to evaluate candidates or to even evaluate existing employees, um, then there is a good chance that that system is high risk. And if that system is high risk, whether you are a user, so if you're a user, meaning you're using a system that, or a deployer, that is being sold to you, you still have certain obligations. So you have to make sure you use the system according to instructions of use. You have to make sure in certain cases you even do a fundamental rights impact assessment. You have to monitor the system for possible incidents. So even just as a user, you have obligations. But if you are a provider, so you're actually placing that system on the market and selling to someone else, you have quite more significant obligations. As we said, you have to ensure compliance with requirements. So, for instance, around data sets, around documentation, transparency, human oversight, robustness, and ensure ex ante conformity assessment. So, before you actually sell the system, you have to ensure that you have undergone the process of evaluating that conformity. So, So indeed, that's really kind of the core of the business, right? So companies should know, software development companies, the kind of products they are selling. So, but that's certainly very important. They know whether their product is going to be classified as high risk or not. So it's really about, understanding very well the risk classification levels.
We delve a little bit deeper. Just if we were looking at this now, how do you evolve because everything is moving so quickly?
I think this is a fundamental question around regulation in general, because general regulation is always comes a bit ex post, right? So you regulate something when you see that there is a social issue or an economic issue emerging. So something that you identify as a possible potential problem and that needs certain specific rules. So I think the nature of regulation is always a bit like that. And of course, when it comes to technology, it evolves very fast. This creates an additional layer of complexity, because the pace at which regulation advances is certainly not the same pace of technology. And partly should be like that because regulation is the subject of a democratic process, right? So we want to make sure that everyone agrees or has a say, and this takes time. Um, that being said, that doesn't mean that, of course, it's a lost battle, or I mean, there is no way you can regulate necessarily an evolving technology, because it's always possible, in my view, to identify certain elements of flexibility in the legal text so that you can somewhat anticipate possible evolution. This is indeed quite difficult. It requires a lot of thoughtful analysis. That is why often there is a discussion about technology neutral regulation. So, which means you want to regulate a certain activity regardless of the type of technology that you're using. Now, the AI Act focuses on AI systems, right? Because somehow the rationale is that this type of technology, or family of technologies, I should say, uh, raises certain questions that are not the same as any software or any automation tool. So that is why we have an AI Act. They focus on solving certain of the issues around AI specifically, like the complexity or the robustness or let's say the data-driven component, the opacity. So we needed something specific on that. But we that doesn't mean that we are regulating only one specific architecture or one specific technique. So I would say the I Act focus on the whole family of technology. So in principle, any evolution of the technology that also would, you know, meet certain characteristics, as I just said, in terms of transparency, for instance, or opacity and so on, would be captures also in the future. But I acknowledge that this is not an easy task, and but that is why in some cases the text can be seen also relatively vague, because it requires a little bit of adaptation over the course of time.
And when we look into a little bit more detail for prohibitance implications and opportunities for kind of ethical AI governance, where we've got violating fundamental rights, which are social scoring, so engaging in social scoring, real-time remote biometric identification, and there isn't particularly stringent privacy measures. And then there's the concern or worry about manipulating human behavior, which could ultimately cause harm. How do you see this playing out between industries that are reliant on some of these systems, then adapting, and then also having that innovation? Because I remember interviewing Sebastian, and what he said, Sebastian Hellisman, what he said to me was, people have to remember that this is about risk mitigation. It isn't necessarily about trying to get the balance between innovation and regulation right. And I don't know if that's a fair comment or not, but how do you kind of see that playing out in reality?
Um, well, I think it's also about a balance, in my view. One of the stated objectives of the AI Act is not only indeed to make sure that we kind of mitigate and address, or even eliminate in certain cases, risk that we as a society don't like, right? But also, it's also about ensuring common conditions for the marketing of AI products. So it's also about ensuring that by setting certain safeguards around the way you develop and market AI-based products in the EU, you also create a market for that, and therefore, you actually enable innovation to thrive, and adopters, or companies and citizens to actually adopt AI system, therefore creating a market for that. So I would say the two components are, that's why we, in the white paper back in 2020, we talked about an ecosystem of excellence and an ecosystem of trust. That means, so the European approach on AI is about, okay, we want to make sure that, on the one hand, we have the capabilities, the tool to actually develop an AI in Europe, and at the same time, making sure that, that AI we develop is trustworthy. But the two go together. So, and ultimately, the objective is to reap more of the benefits of AI by limiting the risk. So, ensuring that we do use AI because we trust it.
Yeah. And so let's, on that kind of trust as that cornerstone foundation, and also having that golden thread of ethical usage of AI and having that kind of transparency, because, I've now interviewed over 600 quote unquote top leaders in the world of AI from around the world. And the vast majority of them will put their hand up and say, we don't actually really know how AI works. Right. And people listening in and saying, well, that sounds crazy. Well, under the hood, these neural nets, a lot of time they're making decisions where you don't quite know, you have an idea how they're making these decisions, but you don't really know. And there's an element of drift that when you actually get into production and deployment, it kind of goes off to the side, and that's where a lot of kind of iterations kind of start with that. How do you see that ethical AI being that cornerstone to building trust and making sure that we're mitigating bias and discrimination? Because my kind of take from the act is that organizations at any time could be audited to kind of show how you're making these decisions, where we've had up until now large companies, big companies, whatever type of companies, have been grading their own homework.
The AI Act certainly intends to put in the law requirements that didn't exist before, right? And to some extent, as you say, is an attempt to regulate things that we do not fully today understand. I mean, to the detail. But that's partly the challenge and the need, in the sense that if we want to have, if we actually, the market, we see those systems entering the market, and we see this technology evolving. I mean, not fully transparent, perhaps, not fully explainable, but these systems are being used. It's important to set some guardrails, so that even though we do not know yet exactly how do we make sure that this, the technology is explainable, how do we make sure that people are not discriminated, but we need to kind of set the bar high in some sense. And I think part of the criticism also that was raised when the Commission issued the proposal is that certain requirements are not, technically either feasible or easy to implement. And then I see that point. I do not deny that, but in a way, to the extent that was necessary to ensure that we make a step forward in having AI systems that are trustworthy, I think there is a value in having a legal framework that indeed sets an objective, including for the technical communities to really invest in certain research agenda to find solutions. And that is why, actually, going back a bit to some of the initial choices that I made, was to rely on a type of framework which is the so-called new legislative framework, where you have the law that sets certain legal requirements, like somewhat high-level legal requirements around data, around robustness, but then you let the technical communities come up with the technical specifications, with the technical solutions to actually operationalize those legal requirements. Because indeed, you want the technical solutions to be always state of the art, that can actually evolve faster than the legislation.
And again, we'll have this in less than 24 hours, but how does the final text of the AI Act depart from maybe your initial thinking from the Commission proposal? And how do you evaluate those possible changes?
Yeah, personally, really on a personal note, initially, I would have liked to see the AI Act having basically focusing on overall, let's say, governance and substantive requirements. So really, what is that we need to know to be sure to have for AI systems to be trustworthy? What kind of substantive requirements we need to have them in place? Because as I just said, I was aware from day one that not all solutions were ready at the time. So we know the importance of proper data sets. We know the importance of AI systems to be robust. We know the importance of AI systems to be transparent. But that doesn't mean that we know today how to do it, right? Or necessarily all of them. So for me, it was important to really focus on what the most essential substantive requirements, and then start working already on that, and as well create a governance system, to make sure that we know who does what. So very clear also enforcement structure. I would have personally preferred more limited scope of application, like for instance when it comes to high risk of prohibitions, because this is where, in my view, we should have evolved a bit the legal text of the scope, depending on uh, first the emergence of issues. So do we have issues in AI used in the financial sector as opposed to in the law enforcement sector, and also the technological evolution. But even from that respect, I mean, the Commission already took a bit of a broader scope of application since the get-go. So if you look at Annex 3, for instance, for high risk, we had already quite a number of applications there. But then if we look a bit further to the changes that were made, so I think one very important change compared to the Commission proposal was the extension of the scope of the AI Act from, let's say, end-use AI systems. So indeed, the AI Act in the Commission proposal focused on AI systems based on their intended purpose, and indeed, as we said before, they're regulated based on the risk they pose. Whereas the final text has a new chapter around general purpose AI models. So essentially, it's this new technological evolution, the foundation models in essence, and therefore the AI Act goes a bit up in the value chain. So it goes from the final end system to kind of a component, albeit extremely important component of what could be a final application. And so that's a major shift. And then another part of the changes that perhaps I would have some doubts is the fact that, as I hinted at before, the final version of the AI Act includes a number of provisions that tend to overlap with other legislation. An example would be indeed provisions around the processing of personal data, like emotion recognition or biometric categorization. These are issues that are today already regulated by GDPR. So I believe that this overlap may lead to some questions of implementation. And similar, for instance, if we think about overlap with certain type of consumer protection legislation, certain provisions now may overlap with provisions around the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. When, for instance, you have consumers that suffer economic damage from unfair commercial practices. We may have, in the current provisions in the AI Act, also provisions that tend to overlap with that as well.
It's a very, very complicated text, right? So when I talked at the start about being overwhelmed and, I can only just imagine, these finite details keeping you up all night and you got your life on hold, right? as you just think and over all these different possibilities and what ifs, right? So, and I think everyone has to remember that we can do these strategy loops forever, but you need to get to the strategy execution loop and have a bias to getting things done, right? So I think anyone can throw stones. When we look at the reality of actually implementation, how do you see this kind of playing out in reality? Because it's hard enough to get anybody to decide on anything. So I just try to like where how do you even go about doing that? So just your thoughts.
Yeah, so well, there is some good news, meaning that the AI Act, as we said, is going to be published soon and enter into force expected 1st of August. But not all provisions will become applicable that day. So actually, the majority of the provisions will become applicable in 2 years, so 24 months. There will be some provisions applicable after 6 months, notably around the prohibitions, and some other provisions in 12 months, notably around the general purpose AI models, the foundation models. But most provisions will become applicable after 24 months, so around high risk, so where most compliance burden exists. So this is good news, because I think companies should have more time to understand, analyze, and therefore see how they are impacted. But certainly, if you look at the text of the AI Act, I mean, there is quite a number of action items that still need to be completed. So there are several assessments about that, but between 30 and 40, let's say, action items, meaning that the Commission mostly will have to adopt either delegated acts or implementing acts or guidelines or templates or code of practice. So this is quite a fair high amount of activity that needs to take place in order for the legislation to be clear enough so that it can be applied. And I believe that is a bit the main challenge. So on the side of the institution that needs to accompany this legislation to a concrete avenue for application. So there is still a lot of work to be done there. And indeed, this work looks like kind of essential, because some of these tasks that need to be completed are quite important. Think, for instance, about the code of practice for foundation models, or guidelines about how to understand the prohibitions or the AI definition. So some of these items are quite important, and I believe until those items are completed, it may not be so obvious to understand exactly what companies need to do.
Gabriele Mazzini, Team Leader AI Act, Director General European Commission, also known as Architect and Lead Author of the EU AI Act and MIT Fellow. Thank you very much for joining us today and providing fantastic insights on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
On the 26th of November, join us for the 6th Annual AI Awards at the Marco Hotel in Dublin. This year's event promises to be our largest and most impressive yet, with over 300 community members in attendance and over 48 applications of AI in action. This truly is an incredible world-class event, and we are inviting you to this event. Experience the excitement live, because we're going to be capturing this with a world-class film crew, and it's going to be streamed online. However, if you want to join us in person, book your table now, because opportunities are limited. If you're interested in sponsoring this year's awards, please contact me at Mark@AI Awards for more information and see the best in class of AI applications on the island of Ireland.